Hi, my name is Eric.Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting, an independent and technology agnostic digital transformation and ERP consulting firm. And I want to talk today about this topic of what it means to get Accentured. Recently, my colleague Brian Potts from Third Stage wrote an article asking the question, have you ever been Accentured? And the article provoked a lot of conversation, a lot of feedback. And in fact, I received a lot of personal emails from customers that were using one of the big five consulting firms or one of the big system integrators. And I even received a lot of messages from people that actually work with these system integrators as well. And most of the feedback was confirming or commiserating in some cases with the output or the things that we had talked about in that article, or that Brian talked about in that article. And just as a disclaimer to this whole conversation is that I used to be part of the machine. I used to be, early in my career, a consultant at one of the big system integrators. And so I was part of the problem at one point, and that's really, at the end of the day, why I wanted to start Third Stage Consulting and why I wanted to create an independent technology agnostic company that was more aligned with clients' interest in representing clients versus representing the software vendors and representing the economic self-interest of trying to staff hundreds of people on these big global SAP and Oracle and Microsoft types of projects. So that's the impetus for Third Stage, and that's also a disclaimer as far as my history and where I come from. But when we talk about the term getting Accentured, even though it creates some chuckles and some conversation, it really doesn't apply just to Accenture. We're actually talking about any sort of big system integrator, whether it's Deloitte or Capgemini, IBM, whoever the big system integrator is. And the thing that we see with these big system integrators is that they don't necessarily always act in clients' best interests, and they don't necessarily do what's right for the client, and they don't necessarily do what's right to make a digital transformation or ERP project successful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the three things that go into this whole concept of getting Accentured or getting taken advantage of by some of these big system integrators. And the first thing that comes to mind is the system integrators oftentimes will distract clients from the real risks, or they won't identify the risks for the clients as it relates to one of their own system integration projects. And what I mean by that is a lot of times these projects keep going and they're running for a period of time, and the risks aren't being identified, they're not being managed, and the risks percolate and become a problem later on, and the client ends up spending more time and money fixing those problems later on. And actually, this phenomena starts before the implementation ever really begins. And I want to share just real quickly a slide that outlines this concept in a little bit more detail. And this slide talks about this concept of cliff diving. And this is a verb or another term we came up with as it relates to what we see with system integrators and some of the big ERP consulting firms out there, is oftentimes they'll push clients to start these projects before they're really ready. And what ends up happening is the system integrator will bring in a big army of consultants. They'll start billing, the meter will start running, time will start ticking. The system integrator ends up taking control of the project because there isn't a clear direction, there isn't a clear blueprint for what needs to happen with the project. So that's one of the criteria, one of the things that we see. The other aspects or the other components of cliff diving is that we end up focusing on technology more so than the business. And at the end of the day, business should drive your digital transformation. And that's something that gets lost in this whole concept of cliff diving. Too much time and money spent on the project, people get frustrated. It's oftentimes too much for the business to absorb, and there's a lack of internal ownership and buy-in. So when we talk about cliff diving, we're talking about the time you've decided what the software is going to be, or that you're going to move forward with the digital transformation initiative until you actually start that implementation. And what ends up happening is the big system integrators will often push you into starting that project right away when you're not ready. You've got to get your ducks in a row. There's a lot of stuff you need to be doing that's very foundational to make sure that you own the project, you own the system integrator, you manage that system integrator well, you manage your time and resources effectively, and most importantly, you just have clear direction and a clear business blueprint for where you want to head. So that's one of the big challenges we see with the risk component of system integrators. So that's the first thing, is system integrators oftentimes will not properly identify what the risks are. In fact, they escalate the risks in some cases because they're trying to get their self-interest fulfilled, which is to get the army of consultants staffed on your project as soon as possible, which leads to the second thing, which is increased cost. So it's very expensive to have 10, 20, 50, 100 full-time consultants on your project sitting around trying to build stuff when you're not ready for them to be building stuff and you don't even know what you want them to build yet. So if you're trying to make operational decisions, you're trying to get your leadership team aligned, you're trying to get your middle level management team aligned, you're trying to design your organization, define what that shared service model is going to look like or how your business processes are going to be standardized. If you're doing all that stuff while the meter's running, your project is going to get out of control pretty quickly in terms of cost. And when I worked at one of the big system integrators back in the 90s, I was in my mid-20s and I just had finished grad school and went to work for one of these firms. And I remember the first project I was on, I was put on this project with a very clearly defined scope, but it was probably only about 2 to 3 hours a day of work that I had to do. And I was trying to scrounge up work to do to keep myself busy and to keep myself from getting too bored in those early days. And I remember thinking that, there's 40, 50 people on this project and we're not all operating at full capacity, but yet we're billing the client 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And that was the expectation. So I'm not saying all companies are like that. I'm not saying that's the norm. It's what I saw. It's what I experienced as being part of the machine, as I mentioned. And it was in our best interest to bring on a big team of people that could start billing right away. So any thought of, deferring until the client was ready or making sure that the client could get the foundation in place themselves or with some outside help, that was kind of frowned upon because it hurt us because we couldn't get those 30 or 50 people fully staffed on there, and they couldn't get people like me that were just out of college on that project. So that's the other thing we have to look at is how does this affect costs and how can we better manage those costs? So risk is the first thing. Escalated cost is the second thing we have to think about. And then the third thing that we see with many of the system integrators is this uncanny ability to keep third parties out. And, oftentimes when we're working with clients and we're helping manage these system integrators, we're not always the most popular people in the room if it's with one of the big system integrators. And part of that is because we're agnostic. We're not there to shove technology down the client's throat, and we're there to represent the client and make sure that we are doing what's right for the client, make sure we have clear direction, and also making sure we're holding the system integrator accountable. So because they're so big and they have so many resources at their disposal, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll have a full-time account manager, and their only job is to build relationships with the client and just permeate within the organization to where you're taking them out to dinners, you're taking them out to ball games or whatever, which in and of itself isn't bad, but they're investing this time and money to just build those relationships that oftentimes lead to irrational decisions as it relates to whether or not we should use this big system integrator or whether or not we should bring in the system integrator now or wait 90 days or whatever it is until we're ready for it. So that's the other thing is they have this ability to keep third parties out. Oftentimes they'll provide free services. They might create fear, uncertainty, and doubt around those third parties. And also it's largely because they have the brand name and the brand recognition. They'll use that to their advantage too and say, look, we're Accenture, we're Deloitte, we're Capgemini, we're, fill in the blank. And there is a certain cachet that goes along with that. So that that's another way that they use, their strengths as a strength to help them. But again, we have to look at what's best for you, the client and the organization. So at the end of the day, those are the three big problems we see. We often see these three things being a conflict of interest. This is something that escalates costs. It can be somewhat disruptive to the organization and create a great deal of risk that isn't necessary. So it brings us to the final conclusion here of what do we do about it? How do we manage these system integrators? So first and foremost, we have to recognize that these system integrators, whoever you're working with, is very important to your project. They have the expertise, the skills, the technical and functional software specific skills that are going to be needed to make this project successful. The problem is when they take over the entire project and go outside their sweet spot and start working on things that should be handled by agnostic third parties or even by yourselves within your internal organization. So at the end of the day, I think the two pieces of advice I would give is, first of all, recognize that it's your project and not to fall into the peer pressure, into the pressure of feeling like you have to move forward now with your project, or that you have to follow the plan that has been prescribed to you by your system integrator. At the end of the day, it's your project. You have every right to push back and take ownership and resource it how you want, and question every single resource, so you don't have people like me from 20 years ago that are on your project billing 12 hours a day when they're only working 3. Those are the kinds of things that you should own and you should have visibility and transparency into. So own the project. And then the second thing is to not be afraid to use independent third parties. And this is a role that Third Stage fills with large SAP projects, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, and helping clients manage the system integrator, manage the overall program, and also ensure that the clients are ready for the transformation and they've built a solid blueprint, a solid project governance, solid risk mitigation framework, a QA framework for the system integrators. We've clearly defined what our business processes are going to look like, what our organization is going to look like going forward. And we use that entire foundation, that entire blueprint is the thing that drives the project on behalf of the client, rather than letting the technology and or the system integrator take over the project and run it the way they want to. So that's a key, very important, subtle difference in terms of how you can take control of the project. Is you need to own it, leverage third parties where it makes sense, and hopefully that helps. So I want to thank you very much for watching this video. I'd be curious to hear any stories or examples or experiences you've had. Feel free to reach out to me. You can contact me at eric@thirdstage-consulting.com, and feel free to leave comments here on the YouTube video as well. So thank you very much for your time. Hope this was helpful, and look forward to chatting with you soon. Take care.